practice, which are often called nature of the mind practice, the central focus is the mind itself. When we come to investigate, we investigate not so much the person, but the mind itself. And so therefore, what we find in these traditions, as a basis for that Vipashyana practice, when we do Shamatha practice, also therefore the emphasis in Shamatha practice in those traditions is not so much the breath, but the mind. And those two practices of observing the mind or resting in awareness are the Shamatha practices that are recommended there, because in Vipashyana we're going to investigate the mind. And so before we go to a Vipashyana practice using the mind, let's review a few of the points we looked at in terms of the mind. So there are a number of terms used here, such as mind, consciousness, awareness. And when we speak very generally, they often have the same meaning. So in that Shamatha practice we said to rest in awareness, then we're resting in our mind, we're resting in consciousness. What we need to be careful about is that sometimes the word consciousness, but particularly the word awareness, can be used to mean other things. And unfortunately, different translators translate different Sanskrit terms with the same word awareness, and then there's mass confusion. For example, in the Shamatha practice we have those two tools, mindfulness to hold the object and introspection to monitor. Some translators translate that word introspection as awareness. Confusing. And then in some traditions, in fact in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions, I'll actually back up a bit. Remember we said there we can talk about 3 levels of mind. We can talk about coarse, subtle, very subtle. So of course, we're here now. Our mind is this level. And remember there's a whole bandwidth there. And we have that threshold of conscious, subconscious and so forth. And so of course what we're doing in Shamatha practice is refining this coarse mind, making it more workable, bringing that threshold down. And then eventually, when we achieve Shamatha, we're down at the level of the subtle mind. But then we also talk briefly about this very subtle mind, sometimes called primordial consciousness or Rikpa or so forth. And this is the level of mind we're trying to gain access to in Tantra or Vajrayana. And here in the Mahamudra Dzogchen traditions, when we're doing this Vipashyana practice called nature of mind, we're really trying to gain access to this. And so actually what you find in these traditions, the word mind is referring to these two levels because it's conditioned mind. And when they use the word awareness, it means this. So actually in Mahamudra Dzogchen, if it's mind, it's not awareness. If it's awareness, it's not mind. Because that's how they use the word. For them, mind means conditioned mind, and for them, awareness means unconditioned mind, or very subtle mind. In fact, a term that's used in Dzogchen for this very subtle mind is Rigpa. Which is a Tibetan word, and Rigpa literally means awareness. So therefore, if we're following these traditions and they use the word awareness, then generally they mean this. Whereas here, in our Shamatha practice, when we're saying rest in awareness, we're not saying rest in a very subtle mind. I think that would be impossible for us. We're saying rest in our coarse mind. So just to be careful when we see these words, what is the context and the tradition, how they're used. And of course we saw that in general, when we talk about the mind is defined as that which is clear and knowing. Or sometimes translated as clarity and awareness. So here in the definition of the mind we see the word awareness. But there the word awareness is talking about the function of the mind. What does the mind do? So the word awareness is not so much a noun but a verb. That the mind is aware, that's its function. And clear or clarity, of course, we saw there was the mind, therefore the mind means the mind is not physical, and clarity means therefore things can appear in the mind. And we come to see this or realise this through shamatha practice. Simply by observing the mind more and more closely, we come to directly see this clarity and knowing, this clear and knowing qualities of the mind. Whereas, and so this is sometimes called the conventional nature of the mind. But here when we talk about Mahamudra and Dzogchen being nature of mind practices, we're talking about the ultimate nature of mind. And of course the ultimate nature of the mind is how does the mind exist? And of course the assertion is here, like everything else, it's empty of inherent existence. It does not exist independently, it does not exist from its own side. But again, in the Mahamudra Dzogchen tradition, when they talk about nature of mind, in those traditions, they're mainly talking about this, the very subtle mind. So, when they say, what is the nature of the mind, you often won't just see emptiness. You'll see something like that the nature of the mind, the ultimate nature of the mind, is the union of clarity and emptiness. Because when we're realizing here the ultimate nature of the mind, there is an experience of emptiness, but within clarity. And so therefore, they describe the ultimate nature of the mind usually in this way. But of course here, when we are doing Vipashyana practice on the mind, then of course we're investigating this mind because that's where we are. And what we can come to a little taste or insight into, of course, is emptiness. And that's what we're going to be doing today now, a number of times, is we're going to be investigating the mind to see, is there a mind or consciousness or awareness here that exists from its own side? Is it findable? Can we find it somewhere? And hopefully then we can come to that insight that, like everything else, it lacks independent existence. So, before we go to the practice, are there any questions about the mind?
Whole count and background. How does it go here?
Right. So when we talk about foreground, background, and again we're talking about observing the mind and the contents, like the sky and the clouds. Here we are focusing on the background. You could do a Vipashyana practice looking for foreground. So you could...
Movement.
Yeah, you could movement. You could do a Vipashyana practice and look for a thought, look for an emotion. But that's not what we're going to be doing today. That's a valid practice, so you could do that. You could consciously bring up an image or a thought and go, well, that looks really objective there, but can I find it there? But that's not what we're going to do today. We're just going to look for the awareness itself, the background, the space of the mind. That's what we're going to be focusing on today.
And it's also, I'm looking for something intuitive, like the self.
No, nothing's intuitive. You're looking for what's appearing. So even with the self, it wasn't intuitive. The self was, we have a very strong, clear sense of me. Very strong. And particularly if we think of some situation like I'm being criticised or praised, it's not some sort of subtle, obscure thing I'm looking for. It's there. So what we're trying to do is, it seems to be here, very clearly. Is it really here? So similarly with the mind, although what we're going to find in the practices that we're going to do is a little bit a different approach. With the person we did yesterday, it was a more analytical approach. And we were using that reasoning that, okay, it seems to be here. Now, if it does exist, then it must be the same as the body and the mind or different than the body and the mind. And if we can't find it in those two places, it doesn't exist. So we were using that sort of logical reasoning approach to investigate. But today's practice will use a different approach. It's a much more direct approach.
Is there a correlation between the subtle mind and the dream state?
Dream state. Remember, these levels are ones that we use for meditation, to relate to with meditation. And certainly in the coarse mind, there are many bandwidths. And so I think when we fall asleep and go into dreaming, are we in this mind? Maybe not, but we're certainly down here somewhere. We're much lower or deeper than in the waking state. Because in the dream state or sleeping state, the sense consciousnesses have shut down. So we're definitely moving down here. But are we here in the dream state? Maybe not.
This union of clarity and emptiness. So, what would be the metaphor or analogy to? Because like emptiness and mind is like the sky and the thoughts and the content is the clouds. So, So, what is the clarity and the emptiness?
Right. Because here, that experience, the experience of emptiness, is within clarity. And so we see that without the clarity we couldn't really have that experience of emptiness. And so that's how they define. So they say that the nature of the mind, the real nature of the mind, is this. The very subtle mind. And the very subtle mind is this union of clarity and emptiness, because the very subtle mind is beyond duality.
Is it emptiness beyond duality?
Well, emptiness is beyond duality, sure.
So I don't there's a difference between the clarity and the emptiness and just the emptiness.
Again, clarity and emptiness are not two different things. You can't have emptiness and clarity separately. So here, in the Coarse and Subtle, we are simply coming to realise that that mind is not existing independently. And then therefore we come to that experience of emptiness. Whereas, and really to answer this well, we have to talk more, and we don't have time for that in this retreat, of course, talk more about what that really is to answer it well. But from a Vipashyana perspective, this is the source of everything. And so therefore this, when we're in that mind, then there is always a union of clarity and emptiness. Whereas here, that's not the case. That now there's no union of clarity and emptiness. In fact, there's no emptiness at all, and our clarity may be not so obvious. So even if we start to have an experience of emptiness here, there won't be this. But as soon as we gain access to that, this is the case, always.
As soon as we gain access to emptiness.
No, to the very subtle mind. The very subtle mind is always a union of clarity and emptiness, whereas the two other minds are not.
I'm curious about something that I'm not sure we have the time.
Right.
About practice. I'll just ask it. And I read somewhere in a book about this, I think it's well known, this operation they used to have for people with epilepsy, where they would cut like the corpus callosum, I think it's called, the device that connects the parts of the brain.
Sure.
And then they have reports of people just like having all these kind of weird
Different
stuff.
experiences.
Like
Sure.
someone would wake up from slapping and realize it's his own hand, or someone would get a cigarette in their mouth, and then the other hand would just like slap it. So I was wondering what you think about that.
I don't know. It's very interesting. I think it would be could be quite helpful, I think, to do some collaborative research there. And there is some beginnings of doing that, and that's certainly something that people like Alan Wallace and that are very, very much interested in, is to research the relationship between the brain and the mind. So yes, I think that can be a very interesting area of research, and I think that you'll see more of that. I mean, we've had little bits of it, but not much so far.
Yeah, there is interesting questions.
Of course, of course.
There were a lot of research on that. I read a lot of books, a lot of cases. It's just hard to do experiments. All you can do really is wait for someone to get injured.
True. For that sort of experiment, yeah.
But no. The question about we look at the mind as the movements in the mind as like another sense, right?
As
sense, we have 6 senses, right?
but we're using the same sense to look as what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying the thoughts I have are part of the sense.
Is the mental sense here, yeah.
So my question is, what makes the thought arise?
Makes the thought arise.
So, for example, if I have a feeling, it arises for a reason, like
Causes and conditions.
yeah, causes and conditions. So, what causes and conditions makes thought arise? For example, if I do something that I don't like, usually the thought about it arises the days after. So my question is, what makes it arise? If that makes sense.
I mean, again, the general answer, of course, is causes and conditions. And sometimes part of that condition is your volition, your active volition to think a thought. Sometimes you don't have that, but
I don't know the word volition.
volition, intention, desire, not desire, intention. You have an intention to think, and so that would be one of the conditions that would lead to the arisal of a thought. Sometimes we don't have that consciously, and part of the thing is that, of course, there are a lot of things going on down here that we're not aware of. And so we're only aware of them when they sort of stick their head up here. So often when things come up, thoughts, emotions, memories, we go, where did that come from? Because we only notice it already when the process has done a lot of things down here and we don't pick it up. So if we do shamatha practice and we bring that threshold down, we'll be able to start to pick up a lot of these causes and conditions which are leading to what's appearing in our mind. And that's going to be very helpful to see how our mind is functioning or dysfunctioning.
I mean, that's interesting, but that's not exactly what I'm asking. I'm just asking for like senses come from physical things, right?
Sorry?
Me feeling something like in my hand comes from some physical reaction, right?
There's some physical input,
Yeah,
like visual.
Exactly, there's an input.
Yeah.
So what's the input to the mind? This is self-contained within the mind, what you just described.
Right, but the input could be also physical.
To the mind.
Yeah. I mean, like when you look here, you have a experience, visual experience, and that acts as input to the conceptual mind, and the conceptual mind goes, ah, flower.
So does Buddhism have any? So things act according to functionality, right? According to rules. For example.
Well, cause and conditions.
If
Everything.
something is red, then yeah, cause and conditions.
Everything's cause and conditions.
Yeah. I'm just saying, for example, we seeing the color, we have a pretty good explanation of what are the causes and conditions, right? We understand pretty much the causes of me seeing red. And
Wow.
so no, I mean not the consciousness, the feelings.
Well, I think there's still a lot of work being done there, but go on.
If I write with the pen, then I know that the pen is dropping some sort of something, and then I can see it with my eyes. Right? Like, there's a sense of what makes me what. You have a good sense of physical causes and conditions.
Well,
Not to the full extent, obviously, but
I'd say that we're only just scratching the surface, to be honest. We think we have a good idea, but I think now what we're finding is maybe our idea is not as good as we think. Particularly if we start going into quantum mechanics. So, I mean, like physics, classical physics, a century ago, thought they had a very good idea of the physical world, but then it started to get a little bit shaky. So, as you were saying yesterday, we're continually refining these theories, and I think in the terms of perceiving the world, we've still got quite a lot of work to do.
maybe it's. I mean, I know
Yeah.
I studied quantum physics, so I'm sure. But yeah, maybe it's. Yeah, I think it's something else.
It's what, sorry?
it's just maybe we don't understand things on the deepest level, but we still have
Sure, and we have
in a macroscopic
Yeah,
way,
exactly.
good understanding.
And
Do we have macros?
Yeah.
Does Buddhism?
exactly it does. I mean, and for that there's a whole subject matter called in Tibetan lower rig, minds and awareness, where you study all of this. How does the mind function in terms of this? So that if you want to really know, I suggest you study that topic. I mean, it's a massive thing, including how mental afflictions, perception, all of this stuff is included there. It's a big topic. Let's do the practice now because we're running out of time, and then we can do some more questions after that. So what we're going to do is do a Vipashyana practice based on the Shamatha practice of resting in awareness. So we'll begin with some merely Shamatha practice, resting in awareness for some minutes, some time, and then we will start to investigate the awareness. So let's do that practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the sensations of the breath.